I'm Michael Christensen, and I'm doing a video series about structure and about three-act structure, essentially. Last week, I did a video about your first act. Today, we're going to talk about your second act. Kind of. Because I am not alone in thinking that the three-act structure is a little bit limiting. Your first act, 25% of your story or so, that's the setup, introduction, cool. Your third act, the last 25%, that's conflict resolution, that's the climax, the denouement, fantastic. The middle 50% is usually just act 2, and that's a lot for people to get their heads around. That's why I think it's more helpful to use the 4-act structure instead. We're going to divide act 2 in half, and we're going to talk about both halves today. Functionally, there's act 1, act 2A, act 2B, and then act 3. I think you can tell with fiction, generally speaking, which act the writers had in their head when the story began. As an example, we're going to talk about the film Speed. Act 1 of Speed begins with the introduction of Keanu Reeves' character. We get to see him in action, defusing a bomb, dealing with Dennis Hopper, all the introduction, up until basically when he finds out there's a bomb on a bus. The last act, the third act of the film, is post-bus. We'll come back to the bus in a minute. But the third act is all about the bus is gone, gotta find Dennis Hopper, gotta figure out what to do about him, and then there's a whole thing on a train. The second act, the middle 50%, that's Speed. Everything you think of when you think about how good Speed is, the film, is in that middle 50%. It's in the second act. It is all the stuff with the bomb on the bus. Everything involving the bus happens in act 2. That's the fun and games, and that's what a lot of advice basically gives you, is that act 2 is the fun and games. Act 2 is the promise of the premise. And I think that's the most helpful way for us to begin. Die Hard, the first act is John McClane is a cop. He's going to this Christmas party. The third act is the final showdown with Hans. The second act is guy trapped in building with lots and lots of terrorists. And it's about him whittling them down and trying to take them out, basically one at a time. It's about him trying to get the police involved, to get called the fire department, anyone he can try to pass this buck off to. But the fun and games, the promise of the premise, is one guy versus a whole bunch of terrorists. In the third act, it's one guy versus two guys. There's not a lot left for John by the time we get to the third act. It's really just, does he have enough bullets? Does he have enough willpower? Can he finish the job? But the promise of the premise, basically the inspiration for the film, all of it occurs in act 2. Die Hard is a much stronger film than Speed. I think Speed is at its strongest in act 2. Die Hard, throughout the film, is a Swiss watch of storytelling. I don't want to call it a perfect movie because one of the main character's arcs does essentially end with him realizing that he's a cop who should kill people again after he killed a kid earlier in his past, so that's a little strange. It's a little bit anti-women in the workplace and anti-women making it on their own. It's very 80s in its sensibilities, but it is also a masterclass in storytelling. And I think both Speed and Die Hard have pretty much a 3-act structure. I have a difficult time parsing where exactly the break from 2A to 2B would be in those films. There's 2 options I like for Die Hard. One is when the body hits Al's car and the police finally realize something is actually definitely going on in the tower. The other is when the police fail to make an impact against the terrorists and John realizes there really is no one to do it but himself. And we'll talk about midpoints next week. I think that's a better time to get into what does and doesn't divide these acts. What is a good midpoint? But we'll talk about that next time. For now, let's talk about my definitions for 2A and 2B. 2A is fun and games. I think that definition absolutely does work. If we're going to talk about fun and games for Act 2, I really think 2A is where that happens. Look at Iron Man. Iron Man 2A is about him building the Iron Man armor. It's a lot of montage, it's a lot of fun testing, and it's very low stakes. There's some hints that the villains are coming. There's clips of them figuring out how to make their own Iron Man armor, but basically we're focusing in on Tony and his unofficial mission to build the armor again. Plus him trying to figure out what to do with his life, what to do with his company, getting closer to Pepper. All of that happens in 2A. The midpoint is when he finds out that his weapons are still being sold under the table to the bad guys. So 2B is about him starting to become a hero, about him becoming Iron Man in action. Functionally, and we'll talk about this some more next week, but functionally the midpoint should flip the hero so that they are no longer reactive, they are now proactive. Wrigley's destroying a toy. So don't mind that sound. That's why I am more inclined to say that the midpoint of Die Hard is when he realizes the cops are going to be completely useless against the terrorists. Not because they're fools, but because the terrorists are so well armed. 2A is a lot of the cops are fools, and they don't believe John is really a cop, or they don't take him seriously. But then when the rocket launcher hits the SWAT van, I think that's the flip. I think that's when John realizes there's no option outside as far as help goes. He has to deal with it himself. That's the midpoint I subscribe to. For Iron Man, the midpoint is extremely clear. It is a mostly dialogue-free scene. Robert Downey Jr. doesn't say anything during the scene. It's just him putting on an Iron Man glove while news plays of innocent people being destroyed and victimized and displaced by his weapons. He's pacing around his workshop, he's testing his glove, he's destroying things, and there's a moment when he sees his reflection and the voice on the news says, "People wonder who, if anyone, will save them." And then he shoots, and he's basically saying, I am going to go be a superhero. Act 2B is about him going after the bad guys, finding out more about how his weapons got into the wrong hands, finding out who the real villain is, and setting the stage for the climax. Act 2, in theory, all across the board, should be setting things up for your climax. But if you're ever going to indulge yourself, 2A is the place to do it. By the halfway point, 2B should be really in favor of setting up the ending. 2A should be reactive protagonists, 2B should be proactive protagonists. Jaws divides really nicely into 4 acts. Jaws begins with figuring out about an attack and trying to figure out what to do about it. The decision not to close the beach, I think, would be the end of Act 1. 2A is about more investigation, another attack. Richard Dreyfuss comes in and begins to offer perspective and sort of chastises the main character and says, why have you not closed the beach? Why have you not done anything you said you were going to do? It's about them finding the other body, trying to figure out whether the shark that was caught is the real shark, digging inside of the corpse to figure out if it's eaten anything, going into the ship underwater, trying to get the mayor to close the beaches, failing. 2B is the hunt beginning. In my opinion, that's when you get Brody, Quint, and Hooper all in a boat together, taking off. And I think Act 3 begins after we hear the Indianapolis speech from Quint, after we know that these characters have a lot invested, after we know everything about them, after we know exactly what they are and are not prepared for, what they are and are not willing to do to take on this shark, what they are and are not willing to sacrifice. Act 3 is the final confrontation with the shark, where lives are lost and attacks are made. I think that final day would be Act 3. 7, which we talked about in our other videos. I'll keep coming back to it because I think that's another really well-written one. I think Act 1 is the first 2 bodies and us realizing this is a serial killer, there are going to be 5 more deaths. 3 bodies are found in Act 2, but a lot more happens in Act 2. Act 2A is a lot of the stuff we expect. It's fingerprints, it's following leads, it's finding a potential suspect and ruling him out and discovering that he's a victim, and it's research and finding this other way to potentially find John Doe, which they do. The midpoint comes when they find his home, and they realize they are very close to him, and then we get to see in 2B a lot more of his mind. The cops find his journals, they hear his voice, we learn a lot more about his mentality, and it begins to get to Somerset and Mills. They have the horrifying encounter with the victim of lust, and the 2 victims of lust, really. And then the 2 of them get a drink. We have that moment when Morgan Freeman just turns to Brad Pitt and says, this is not going to have a happy ending. Because we are in 2B. 2B is all about setting up Act 3. We need to put all the pieces in place, clear the board of anything irrelevant. If a character is not going to play a role in the climax, they should be disposed of by the end of 2B. If a character is going to appear in the climax, the last chance to introduce them is 2B. No one should show up in Act 3 that has not been introduced or foreshadowed or established previously. Even Saving Private Ryan, I would say Act 2B is when they meet Ryan and try to bring him with them, and he says, no, I can't leave. Act 3 then is about finishing his final mission so they can get him home. The fun and games of Saving Private Ryan are Act 2, where they're looking around, trying to find Ryan, but really the fun and games are in Act 2A. That's where you get the fake Ryan, that's where you get the, I would say, when they're going through the dog tags and treating them like poker chips. The more lighthearted, if still somewhat dark, elements occur in Act 2A. Act 2B is where they encounter the German soldier, and where one of them dies, and where we learn more about who Tom Hanks was prior, when he confesses to the group what he did before he was a soldier, because Act 2A can be fun and games, can be sort of lighthearted and still fulfill promise of the premise, but Act 2B needs to be moving us towards our emotional climax, our emotional catharsis at the end of the film and the book. This is way easier with film because I studied film in college, so I'm leaning on film pretty heavily. Films are also easy examples because if I mention a film, you can go and watch it. It's only 2 hours. And because there is a rigid structure in place with most films because they have a time limit, a run time. Books, I know, have word count limits and page limits and all that stuff as well, but there are some big books out there. I think the example will be clear when we talk about midpoints next week, but remember, reactive protagonists are fine up until the midpoint. In the second half, especially in 2B, we should have some proactive protagonists. A lot of superhero movies fail that test because superheroes are very much reactive by nature, and that's okay to a point, but I strongly encourage you to make your protagonists proactive in the second half. Act 2B is about pushing down the gas pedal and propelling yourself toward the climax. That's it, that's the video. Next week I'm going to talk about midpoints and clarify that a little bit more and why I struggle with them when I write. The week after we're going to talk about the third act, and then we're going to talk about endings, which are different, and we'll talk about that when we get to them. If you've enjoyed the video, I really encourage you to subscribe. I have a new goal to reach 100 subscribers by the end of the year. If we can do that, then in the first video of 2021, I will give away an Audible book to one of my subscribers. I don't know who, and I don't know what book it will be. It'll be up to you, up to whoever the winner is. But I want to reach 100 subscribers and continue to grow the channel because I have some really exciting things planned for 2021. Don't forget to ring the bell and hit the like button and leave a comment below. Just do all the YouTube things. Thank you so much for watching. I love you, Victoria.